All right, we're going to get started. Welcome to the second of the Haas seminars for this spring term. It's my pleasure to introduce today Art Brett McQueen, PhD, who is an assistant professor and director for the Center of Pharmaceutical Value, or P-Value, at the University of Colorado Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. His research interests include cost-effectiveness applications and methods development, multi-criteria decision analysis, value-based outcomes contracting, and patient preferences research. Dr. McQueen collaborates with the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review on value-based pricing estimation as well. Turn it over to you now, Brett.
Thank you, Dan. How many folks do we have in the room, by the way?
About 10.
Here, we'll switch the camera around, Brett.
Oh, great. Yeah, it's fun. Look at everyone in person. Oh, I miss it. All right. That's perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
Right.
I'll watch myself presenting, which is never fun. Thank you for the intro and invitation to join this discussion. I wish we were in person. Looks like I just got a annotate invitation. I'm not sure what that is, but anyways, I wish I was there in person, but I think we actually have the chance to meet at ISPOR this year, which would be great. I think looking back, of course, I probably would have planned to travel to Chicago if the planning wasn't happening in the middle of Omicron. So thanks for having me, even if it's virtual. So I'll talk today, your group is really well connected with ICER as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of probably overlap, and feel free to, stop and ask questions. If I don't hear you, it's probably because I was only hearing the mic. So just let me know if I'm missing a comment. Feel free to stop me. Just to start, I want to give everyone kind of a background about our group. It's very similar, I think, as your group there, where maybe a little bit smaller. We've got 5 full-time faculty, about 5 to 7 full-time PhD students at any one point in time. And we have kind of 2 areas of emphasis, pharmacoepi and pharmacoecon. And more recently, the initiative P-Value, or pharmaceutical value, has been really more focused on value assessment outside of its current practice, and that's what I'll be talking about today. My research is really kind of varies across, I'd say, analytic method and collaborators. Colorado is one of 6 states that has a CMS template for value-based contracts, or performance-based risk-sharing agreements, or outcomes payments, whatever you want to call them. So we actually negotiate and track those agreements. That's one example of impact of sort of new reimbursement, novel payment methods. So that's kind of an area that I've been working with both in the commercial and then the public market. That's just an example with Medicaid. And then, of course, with ICER, we've been collaborating with them since 2016, and really kind of led to P-Value and led to our hypotheses that we're testing currently right now. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Just want to acknowledge some of our past investigators. If you know, John Campbell's actually the Senior Vice President of Health Economics now. I believe knows Dr. Lee quite well from the UW days. And then Mel Whittington is now a director there in health economics. And we have our current team that are really kind of pushing this forward. And our collaborators from Hungary who already tested MCDA and have been testing MCDA in Europe and other low and middle income countries. I received support from a variety of different groups, including Pharma Foundation, the University of Colorado, and then ICER as well. So it's an interesting mix of funding. I'm going to start with a little bit of motivation and background on value assessment. I know all of you are really already sort of well versed in this area, but I think it's important that we start with a base of, and you can right off the bat probably disagree with these claims, but the point is to be a little bit, a little bit cheeky with these. But if we really want to claim that value is sort of conventional cost effectiveness, that's change in cost over some change in effectiveness, whether it's qualities or equal value of life years gained, regardless, value could be characterized by conventional cost effectiveness, which is often derived from regulatory approval, phase 3 trials, etc. The second claim, if value is actually synonymous with cost effectiveness, at least in the US, we should have sort of a tight clustering of cost effectiveness medicines, cost effectiveness for commonly prescribed and paid for medicines. And it's hard to find an example, I think, because a lot of what we work on in the US are really high priced biologics. So at least, for example, Dr. Duchette and myself with ICER kind of work more on really highly specialized therapies. You may have been part of that work as well as graduate students. What we found, and this is actually work from John Campbell, and I know Andy was a part of this, Andy Briggs was a part of this as well, where they actually looked at 25 commonly prescribed cardiovascular drugs. It's a great example because there's a ton of competition. There's, in a sense, a lot of generics available, depending on whether it's additive or sort of LDL lowering. There's a lot of different sub-indications. But we still found that, or these authors found that we're really still paying for, it doesn't always hold, we're still paying about 20% of drugs that are really having not great cost effectiveness estimates given the level of competition and the availability of alternative therapies. Claim 1 probably needs further investigation. On the left-hand side, you'll see these hazard ratios. So these are like MACE events, avoiding heart attacks, strokes, CV death. And you'll see that in some cases you've got placebo comparators, and actually in many cases doing better. Yet prices and the trend in the prices are moving up for those active comparators. So it's kind of an interesting area of research to understand. And you're probably also thinking, yeah, but a lot of that has to do with confidential contracts, of course. But I think it's a very telling story that some of our greatest competition, and the argument is always if we increase competition, prices will go down. That doesn't always hold. It needs a little bit more investigation. So, as all of you know, the kind of public pressure in situations like the cardiovascular disease market have led to this bizarre market-initiated value assessment. Really group of value frameworks that are doing this. I would say maybe one or two are actually doing real health technology assessment, but nonetheless, it's the way the US is trying to figure out how to pay for value rather than for anything else that we seem to pay for in our system. So a lot of you probably have seen this as well. I think it's really helpful because decision context, and probably Dr. Touchette probably understands where I'm coming from, that a lot of the comments we get with ICER reviews are just not relevant to the decision context of what ICER's doing. And a lot of comments come down to say maybe it's benefit management or maybe it's more patient-provider interaction. And all of these value frameworks are informative to these different decision contexts. But really where we live, and the research where a lot of you are doing, really lives up way above at the sort of coverage and pricing level. So we have to always keep that in mind. I think Dr. Garrison really put together a nice figure here. All of you really already know ICER. I always cover this just in case you're not that familiar with ICER, but let's just remind ourselves they're asking, in my personal opinion, the most important question that anyone is asking about drug pricing. And that's why they're getting so much press, why they're so popular, and why payers are really taking up their reports and using them in their own decision making, even if it be indirect negotiation. They're asking, what should the price be at market launch? And no one else is really doing that. They're kind of maybe comparing costs, like NCCN, for example, which I totally ripped in an editorial in Pharmacoeconomics. They were asking oncologists their perception of the cost of oncology drugs, which makes no sense from a health economics perspective. So ICER, regardless of whether you agree with their methods or you do not, they're asking the most important question, and they're relying on really well-known scholars in the field and clinicians about their perceptions of value. They do not make direct decisions. This is a normative exercise, and we always have to keep that in mind. So as I mentioned, our first collaboration, I think the first one was the first asthma biologic. We've now done 3 of those reviews, including the most recent one last year. RA and a lot of these meetings over time, ovarian cancer, you start hearing and you start really, listening to patients, different stakeholders, and over time, your brain starts to think, people keep saying the same thing over and over again, which is there's all this other stuff. And even if you remove conflicts of interest, you have to somewhat agree that the way cost effectiveness is being characterized for some of these conditions isn't totally telling the entire story. And ICER themselves have acknowledged that numerous times. But I still think it's a great place to start. And conventional cost effectiveness, or regulatory anchored, if you're familiar with that term, is a really good starting point for negotiations. And as I said, the limitations are numerous, and they do depend on sort of the data that's generated and the assumptions and eventually the inputs that we're using in our cost effectiveness model. So when I hear people say, oh, well, your cost effectiveness model is wrong, or what, it's like the model is not wrong. The model is a synthesis of the evidence. So if anything, we're highlighting how poor the evidence base is in these particular areas. Doesn't mean we can't try to do better. And we are trying, I think, in a lot of ways. So these are just case examples from some of the reviews that we've done. I like to put this out there partly to say we don't just produce cost effectiveness ratios above 150,000 per quality, because that seems to be the trend or people's perceptions. But the other thing is, this is kind of what's presented. So if, say, Dr. Touchette gets up and he's presenting about whatever review he just did, this is the focus. And we have separate chapters for other benefits and contextual considerations. We have the clinical comparative effectiveness sections. Our focus is this. But what we really found, and we didn't produce this, this is Dr. Peter Newman who produced this and his group. We found this trend happening where, yes, okay, if you start at the far left, you've got dominant. So this should be like a no-brainer. I mean, we should have everyone saying that if a treatment is dominant, that should be 100% in my opinion, but it's not. On the far right, we should have basically 100% being low value, but we all know that that's not really the way the US market works. So that one, I'm not quite sure I can say would always be low value. Then you have this sort of middle ground where treatments are cost effective, but people are voting them as intermediate. This started to reveal itself very early on. And I think the first one where I really realized it was rheumatoid arthritis, where really some of the decisions that the panel were making just didn't seem to coincide with the cost effectiveness evidence. And a lot of that had to do with some of the patient input, as well as some of the broader stakeholder input around evidence. So part of the reason, and I'm going to try to push this forward today and get you at least to buy into it, that it really does depend. Our normative, remember, this is why I brought up that this is really a normative exercise. Other criteria are influencing US value interpretations. ICER has published on this. Dr. Peter Newman has published on this. Everyone understands that other criteria, that whether it's actually included in the model or not, is influencing our perception of the value of therapies. Now, I will get into how this actually shows up in coverage and reimbursement, because it's not just the normative perception, it's actually flowing into our real decision making. But a lot of this has to do because value is context and perspective specific. I sit in these meetings, and I'm sure others can confirm, you hear scholars talking about a patient's experience when they have zero experience with that disease. And you also hear patient advocates or manufacturers talking about broader societal criteria when they've generated zero evidence around that. And again, no one's wrong. It's because we have different perspectives and different contexts. And from our early work in p-value, this actually isn't impress. I don't know, I keep trying to change the slide and it shows up with impress. This is already out. And what we did was compare a really small group. It was a pilot work, payer and patient preferences, and found that some of these novel or additional value criteria, there's a lot of overlap. But it's just that they're from a different perspective. So the financial burden on a patient is not the same as the financial burden on a payer. That's a really easy example. But there are other examples that I think are more nuanced. And so this table, I think really tries to show the top row of what we're currently doing. And we totally acknowledge that there's ongoing methods to sort of improve inclusion of these within traditional or conventional cost effectiveness. But I don't know if I'm fully bought into creating a model that's fully societal and patient perspective specific, especially for an organization like ICER, which their direction and their audience are payers. It's not actually patients, and it's not broader society, although maybe they wouldn't mind if uptake happened with those groups. The second row you can see, and we've sort of split this, there's so much debate about whether something would impact a patient or broader society, totally get it. But these are just examples to say some of these additional societal criteria, insurance value, I mean, we should all be caring about how much we're paying for medicines, because you're paying for it out of your premiums, and you'll start paying for more out of your premiums as we continue on with really dramatic, I would say dramatic innovation in the pharmaceutical market. And then you've got rarity, access to vulnerable populations. This isn't just US. If you have been following NICE, they just made a change to this. And I actually changed my slides last night about this because I do think it's worth discussing. And then there's more patient-centric value criteria. What I mean by that is what criteria impact really patients and their families only, not broader sort of societal forces. And that could include something like value of hope, but really reaching important milestones in life, I think is a pretty obvious one that comes up every single ICER meeting. So how do we actually characterize that? It's really a good question. But before I get there, I really want to cover that this isn't, even though I said it's normative from an ICER perspective, sort of showing up in our coverage and reimbursement decisions. This is kind of outdated because when I tried to sign up for formulary lookup, they don't want some pharmacoeconomics guy looking around into this, so they denied my sign up for this. I don't know why. But you'll see that the drugs that I had listed in our case examples have varying levels of coverage, both commercially and publicly. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge they're two separate decision-making. ICER's process is totally different, yet we're seeing the same thing play out in our coverage summaries. Humira, you're probably saying, all right, Brett, but let's be honest, Humira just plays the patent game. You're totally right. It's a weird case with Humira. They just play the patent plus indication game, and they just have a massive portfolio. So that one might not be a good example, but one of the other examples is, the CAR T therapies, which have kind of had really slow uptake. Some of that might have to do with the technology and the process to actually get genetic engineering into somebody's body. That's a tough thing, but over time it's improved, but it's still not widely covered. So just making the broad point that coverage decisions actually are being impacted by our own heterogeneous preferences. of what we value in therapies. And then sort of just back to ICER, we've always really struggled with severe conditions. If you know, ICER has a whole separate process for short-term therapies that have a really big impact for survival and quality of life. And so they essentially have kind of, through a couple of different value framework updates, just admitted we're not really suggesting coverage be restricted, but we'll just leave it open to the payer after we still produce a cost effectiveness estimate. Okay, so the idea with this first part was just to kind of set the stage and for all of us to know, and hopefully I maybe have convinced you, and if I haven't, I'm happy to discuss it with you, that it really cost effectiveness isn't necessarily synonymous with the US view of value, but it's also a good starting point. We're never going to be the UK and institute 30,000 pounds to 50,000 pounds per quality. We're just never going to do that, in my opinion. That's my personal opinion. But what we can do is provide a range of what a price should be, and that's what ICER does, even though that doesn't get picked up in press, and that's what we get picked on probably the most. Now, the normative perceptions that flow into these reimbursement decisions that we're seeing really does suggest heterogeneity in our perception of value. So, but I think the point is, what additional evidence should we be considering? What additional evidence should pharmaceutical companies be collecting? But more importantly, how much should we weigh that evidence versus just our conventional regulatory approval value evidence? Because even pharmaceutical companies have resource constraints. We can't just request that they go and collect every piece of evidence under the sun. We really have to have some way to prioritize it. And that's kind of a good lead in to what we're trying to do is a phase one, is just understand what's important. And then from there, can we collect evidence on those important additional value criteria? And where can we go from there? So I'm going to stop there and see if anyone has any questions before I kind of jump into sort of some of our work in this area. It was totally clear. Everyone got it. There's no questions. I must be excellent today, better than I usually am. Okay. Questions? I was joking, by the way. So, all right. Supplemental value assessment. So, as I spoke about just a little while ago, we have our base, we have our cost effectiveness estimates. What we found during 9 or 10 meetings that we had done was, you know what would be really helpful? Instead of having one person talk about lack of evidence and just sticking to that one point and essentially swaying the entire panel on this one piece of criteria or whatever the value criteria is that is not quantified, is there a way that we can kind of provide an additional decision aid? And that's when we started really exploring MCDA. And I'll get into exactly what MCDA is if you're not familiar, but essentially, really what we want to do is provide more of a structured deliberation, and there are some other implications for the panel, especially at ICER, but other value frameworks, something structured to use that we can guide the conversation. And kind of embedded in this, whose preferences are we talking about? Should we really have a panel talking about a patient experience when they've never had that experience? No. So maybe we should be having sort of a separate group of people talking about their order of importance of value criteria. Again, I'll get into this. And then maybe we have a broader societal perspective that we also discuss. So again, this is a supplement. There are other solutions being proposed in the field that would probably merge all of this into one. You may have heard of something called augmented cost effectiveness from Dr. Garrison, and then generalized risk adjusted cost effectiveness analysis from Dr. Phelps and Lakdawala. And I'll get into that a little bit, but first I really want to try to push forward the idea that I think supplements are better than trying to fix something that I don't think is designed to be fixed that way. So what is MCDA? Well, it's really just literally a souped up pro-con list. That's all it is. You know who actually invented MCDA? Does anyone know who invented MCDA? Ben Franklin. I mean, he invented basically everything that we know. It's pretty remarkable. And he wrote a letter to his friend in Britain who had asked, I have to make really big decisions. There's a ton of conflicting options. How do I make this decision in a way that's a little bit more organized than just a judgment call, a gut feeling? And Ben Franklin wrote back and said, what I do is make a pro-con list, but I extend that pro-con list and I add weights to it. I order the importance and determine how important one criteria is versus another. And I don't believe he actually turned it into like an MCDA score, but he essentially put forth the concept of this. And more recently, it's been split into sort of two different types. One is qualitative MCDA, where decisions are based simply on deliberations of explicitly defined criteria. We're already sort of doing this. If you look at the other benefits and contextual considerations from ICER, they have a whole separate area of the meeting where they kind of give this Likert scale 1 to 5 level of importance about other benefits and contextual considerations. But really what we're trying to do is move closer to quantitative MCDA, where there's actually a score on those criteria that we could add to, say, an outcomes table. So you've got QALYs, EVLYG, and then you've got some clinical outcome, and maybe there's an additional criteria score where one therapy is compared to another, based on all of the additional criteria that are really important to patients. And so there's a few different steps, but really what we're trying to do is push forward a feasible approach for someone like ICER, a group like ICER, or patient groups looking to contribute to ICER reports, a very feasible way of extracting this information and putting it into a quantitative structure that will make sense. And the steps are fairly straightforward. You select criteria as a function of what's important to the stakeholder. Get into that in just a minute. We measure each criterion. So, you know, you can imagine, let's pick like value of hope because it's usually the easiest one. Does it have what we call a fat tail in survival curve? Does it have this option for a proportion of patients to live much longer than they already would have on standard of care? That could be a dichotomous yes/no, right? Where the new treatment automatically wins versus standard of care, which never really had anything like that. Other criterion are a little bit more nuanced and difficult to measure. We then prioritize and weight those criterion, each criterion against another. So it's a simple ranking, but then there's an additional weighting exercise. You can compute the score, and then we interpret on a normed scale. And I've just kind of given a basic score calculation using a linear additive utility model, where we're just simply looking at the preference weight times that particular criterion score, where preference weight just equals the relative importance. You could do this in a discrete choice experiment. You could do this in a best worst scaling experiment. There's all different ways to do it, but we're proposing live elicitation, and I'll show you the result of those, some results that we've had from last year. The score itself really should be evidence-based, and that's kind of where it's been a little bit challenging. What we're doing is adding additional value criteria where we have no evidence on. So it's sort of this chicken or the egg. How do we actually get there? And it's not that straightforward. I'll talk a little bit at the end. We have a session in ISPOR coming up in May, where we're actually going to talk about how much weight should we be assigning to these additional value elements, and I'll get into that a little bit later. We then use a normed score. 100 is the highest score possible for additional value criteria on that particular treatment, versus 0, which would be the least favorable. So you could imagine maybe a new treatment producing a score of 80, whereas standard of care produces a score of 20, something like that, just a basic example. Now, they can be used as a standalone index that quantifies value as a function of those criteria, or we can try to weight thresholds, which I never really thought would come to NICE, but I mean, that was totally blown up after, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, maybe it was last week now, that NICE completely changed their framework to include weighting of thresholds based on severity. So you never know. I guess just never say never in this field. So our first phase was, again, if you remember that table where I had the red box, so we have the patient criteria, and then we have these broader societal criteria. And we're using specific examples where there's a ton of heterogeneity across age, severity of disease, treatment options, ethnicity, and race, something where we can provide 3 different case examples to say, look, these are all in neurology, but they're really heterogeneous in how they impact patients. So neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder, you probably never heard of it. Less than 10,000 people in the world have it. It's almost a subform of multiple sclerosis where blindness and spinal complications are major issues in this population. It's also about half, the population is affected is about 70% women and half are of Hispanic origin, ethnicity-wise. And then SMA obviously affects children and young adults. Mostly there's a whole separate adult group, but we're really looking at the young adult group with pretty severe disability. And then ALS, which I believe ICER is doing a report on right now, and I didn't even know that. So, and that's the other point, is all of these areas of these disease areas have all had recently approved and really high price therapies. So they're good case examples to say, how much does it depend matter in the case, right? Like, does it shift perceptions of value? Would it push people to vote high value or low value? That's the concept we're really trying to push forward. And our approach has already been tested in Europe, so it's not like we're just starting from scratch, but we've made a lot of improvements. The question to the population affected by that disease broadly, but we have this whole webinar that we show, are what factors are important to you when selecting a treatment. So we actually explain to them, we already know that you're getting these endpoints collected during a clinical trial. We're talking about these other things beyond the trial. And it's essentially me babbling on for about 20 minutes about drug pricing in the US and trying to get patients to understand why this is important. So I wouldn't bore you with the details because it's not very fun. But then we have this hybrid workshop event where we do both qualitative and quantitative MCDA. And we use swing weighting. It's just another way to elicit preferences. Again, just like discrete choice, just like best worst scaling, except it's live with actual patients. And it gives us the relative importance of one criterion relative to others. And then we have this qualitative component where we're asking why. And we've done the hybrid workshop event within 2 hours. So this is something that could be an extension. ICER already runs focus groups at the beginning. We think this is very feasible for them to pick up something like this and extend beyond a simple focus group. We have some materials that we develop. So for a lot of patients, we don't want to go in assuming that they know what we're talking about. We try to make visual displays. So one like value domain or value element is patient experience related to treatment regimen. So we give them specific examples. We actually ask them to add to the list and provide examples so that once we're in the hybrid workshop environment, we're speaking to them about their disease, even though there's overlap with other disease areas. Here's another example from Value of Hope, where you've got sort of this first treatment where there's no improvement, and then this Value of Hope where there's a really large improvement where you could essentially be maybe we can call it a cure or whatever is next to a cure. But then you also might have a lot of damage. So one example of this clearly is CAR T, where there are some patients that simply don't make it out beyond the infusion phase, and they unfortunately die from adverse event complications. But then there's this really big improvement for a subpopulation. So these are the kind of figures that we use with patients to bring the message home. We've tested these numerous times. We had a patient engagement expert that drafted them. We then did internal reviews, and then we actually pre-tested these with patients that participated in our focus groups, or what I'd call MCD workshops. So this is just an example. We actually use this sort of ranking and weighting software, and we start with what are the 3 most important elements. We actually have participants rank 3 only, and then we repeat the exercise over and over and over again until we have all 9 ranked. After that, we take a break and we shift gears towards relative importance and understanding how important, say, caregiver quality of life is over value of hope in this particular example. And this is still under review. Unfortunately, we were rejected from a VIH special issue, and I found out PAVE was as well from University of Maryland. So that was just a harsh a harsh rejection there. But this is from NMOSD specifically. We're now working on SMA and getting that recruitment for that going. But this is just examples of what we found. So you'll see that the first rank, which has a pretty significant weight, is uncertainty about long-term benefits and safety. And you have to recognize that NMOSD has never seen treatments like this. Their concern is similar to patients with MS when some of the new therapies came out. Am I going to get PML? Am I going to, which is a really severe brain damage that leads to very quick death, unfortunately. So there's a lot of safety concerns. I know a lot of people are probably thinking that's the argument from anti-vaxxers, but I think this is real when you're the person taking one of these highly specialized therapies and you see really significant adverse events in trials. It is a big deal. Second is experience related to treatment regimen. Reducing infusions is always going to be important. A lot of patients we talked to were either on Medicaid, and they really didn't have time to take a bus every month to the infusion center and try to get infused. So let's say you extend that to every 6 months. That's sort of a big deal for some patients, especially the ones we talk to. And then finally, we specify financial burden from your perspective. That's out-of-pocket expenses, maybe missed time at work that actually cost you money because you're an hourly employee. We're very clear that we're not talking about third-party expenses. So these 3, we've ranked them, and we ranked all the rest of the 9, but these 3 are essentially the most important to patients by way of the weighted distribution. There were a lot of other themes that we really didn't realize were going to be there, and I think are very important. One patient had said, when I was earlier in my disease, this is really not the way I would be thinking about it now, given that I've had experience with it. So this just, I think, underscores the point that we really need heterogeneous preferences, but we also need to update health technology assessment reports every single time new evidence comes aboard, and ICER's doing that now with a 1-year update. Weighting exercises are adding this new dynamic, and this was from a patient. This was not from me. I thought this was really insightful. I think it's always a false choice to choose one versus the other, but I don't think I've ever thought about the space between my top choices. And we actually had a whole discussion about this after, about how they had done 5, 10, 15 studies, and no one really asked them, the order of importance and also the weight of importance of whatever factor they were assessing. So there is a little bit added value, I think, there. And the other kind of thing to to highlight is that with rare disease, because this is a group dynamic and it's group decision making, it's group preferences, we had patients saying, I've never met anyone else with NMOSD. So this is the first time I've heard other experiences, and that actually did change the way I answered questions. So I think this, again, adds value to what we already are doing with focus groups, and it can be done essentially in the same duration. That said, there are limitations, just like there are with any other approach. One of the issues I think in rare disease that's really hard is capturing diversity. And we did our initial focus groups for NMOSD were in English, but our next iteration is going to attempt Spanish language materials and just try to get a little bit more diversity. Although that said, our first focus group was 50% non-white, so we achieved on some level diversity, but we're not quite there yet when it comes to alternative languages, for example. I spoke about this just a little bit earlier, the performance scores on the additional value criteria. We don't know scores of whether this would improve access to vulnerable populations because we really haven't measured it. And it's going to be increasingly difficult, I think, in my personal opinion, to address what everyone wants to address, which is all the additional value criteria, when, for example, all payer claims databases from around the country are just that, all payers. They don't deal with patients that are uninsured, that have no experience in the healthcare market. How are we supposed to address that? There are a lot of gaps, not only just with the method, but I think just period in the field with dealing with a lot of additional value criteria. There are really relevant and rigorous approaches that have been proposed as alternatives. I spoke a little bit about GRACE model from Drs. Lakdawala and Phelps. NICE also recently updated with severity weighting, so they're actually weighting their thresholds based on the severity of the condition. But all of this really just underscores the problem that rare disease and assessments of rare disease are just not easy. And it might be a collection of multiple methods for us to approach the problem, which is pretty significant. So our next phase is patient engagement, finishing out the remaining case examples. And then this summer, we're proposing a multi-stakeholder policy workshop where we're going to not only weight the broader societal criteria, but we're also going to, be weighting within sort of or in comparison to the conventional value, how important are the additional patient-centric criteria value? How much more important are the societal value criteria in reference to conventional value? Because again, back to the idea, pharmaceutical companies can't just collect everything. They need some guidance, and it's up to us as a field, in my opinion, to provide that guidance. Implications, I think, for US value assessment. Personally, the US government, if we go back to something like OTA in the 90s, if you haven't learned about that, you can actually look up their reports. They're publicly available. There's some really interesting reports about technology, distribution in the population, and some of the implications. If you're just looking to fall asleep reading, but also kind of enjoy it, I really highly recommend looking at some of these reports. MCDA is already used in the US for natural resource allocation decisions. Just with all the controversy around thresholds, it might actually be most applicable for healthcare decision-making if the US were to adopt that. Now, for value frameworks, personally, I think this is so easy. You can add this to any focus group, especially around patient-centric criteria. We view the MCDA workshop as more broadly applicable to at least rare disease, to say these are the things that we should be paying attention to as a society, and we should point to manufacturers and other folks to collect that evidence. So it's slightly different than the patient-specific, which should be for each report indicated population, we should be collecting those. And it's very feasible on a budget, and the timing-wise is very feasible as well. We also think that providing some quantitative evidence around order of importance actually could help in deliberations where one person is not often saying, well, I just don't buy it and I'm going to vote low value because of lack of evidence. Well, maybe that's not number one, or maybe they pick a patient-centric criteria that doesn't actually matter to the patients, and it sways the discussion away from what's important to people, especially those that are the end users. And there's also weighting of thresholds. This could directly inform something like NICE is doing if ICER was to take that up. So I just kind of have some final thoughts, just to have a discussion after this. Hopefully I've convinced you that cost effectiveness isn't the full picture, but it does remain a good starting point. It does help us solve problems, especially when you've got so many different sources of evidence and you need to synthesize that. That's where modeling has always helped us, and I think will continue to help us. But MCDA could be really the helpful piece as a supplement to add some of the criteria that's important. And then I'll leave with this question, which is how much weight should we place on additional value elements in health technology assessment? And we'll be exploring that at issue panel 6 at ISPOR on Monday at the end of the day. And that'll be with Jacqueline Bouvoy from NICE, Zoltan Kallo from Budapest, who's kind of the HDA leader in Eastern Europe and for low and middle income countries, and then John Campbell from ICER, and I'll be moderating. So we're going to really kind of dig into this question of we really need to help companies collect evidence and others, and also help HTA be more efficient. So we obviously invite you to join that and hope you join the discussion. So that's all I've got. I'll open it up to questions. Hopefully I didn't go too long, Dr. Touchette.
All right, thank you, Brett. And by the way, at the little break where you were asking questions, if anyone had questions, I was talking, but we had the mute on, so
Oh.
still getting used to the technology here. Dr. Lee.
Brett, I've got a question for you. So, cool stuff on the MCDA side. Why are you laughing, Carter?
Because yours is like up and running. You're like, yeah, I got customers.
No, I mean, I wonder how predictable your results are going to be. Your NMSOD example showed, hey, I need more information. Long-term uncertainty is the biggest hole we have in the evidence base. So you're kind of partway through an N of 3 case series here. How far are you in the other two examples, and are you how concerned are you that piece of information, the highest weight, the number one thing is like, hey, we just need to know more. And I don't know that that's a great solution for the pharma industry. Like, oh yeah, you just need to do long-term trials and you need to generate more evidence, right?
Yeah, it's a good comment, because I think first I'll try to address kind of the first part of your question, which is what we did was go in with what we found from a systematic literature review, essentially the top 10 most important concepts, I'd say, that impact patients beyond the clinical trial realm. So that every time we walked in, we're working with the same value elements every single time, but then within each value element, we're giving specific examples. Long-term uncertainty probably isn't the best example, but like the number of infusions, for example, or something like that, and the financial burden, some of those we get really specific about the example. And in that way, we can sort of translate, maybe this would work, or maybe this does represent other rare disease areas. But I guess my point to push back on is every report, every indication, and every drug will produce different patient preferences because the decision context is specific to that review. So I think we're left with this. That's why we're proposing this as more of like a focus group. Let's do this every single time, because every report could be totally different. What if a new treatment comes aboard in the same disease area and you interview different patients? You're probably going to get a different other benefits and contextual considerations table. And that's okay. I think that's fine, because we're not voting on reports from 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we're reporting on the decision context now, on that drug that's coming to market now. Now, of course, I think to your more important point, which is how helpful is that for pharmaceutical companies? It's a really good point, and this is kind of the reason why I'm proposing, why should we be including all of this stuff in a cost effectiveness model when we don't even have the answer for it, Like long-term benefit and uncertainty could probably be addressed through optimistic and conservative scenarios in a model, for example. So if we know that that's number one, as a modeler, I can say, hey, Steve Pearson, we should probably add a sort of side analysis that says this is the worst you can do, this is the best you can do. And these are sort of the two anchors that we should be talking about. So that's why I think it's more important as a supplement. And it's very fluid between a chapter 4, like a cost effectiveness chapter, and more of like a patient specific criteria chapter, because you're right. I mean, it's going to be difficult for us to justify some of this, but other stuff we actually can collect. We actually can collect information on the burden of illness, and we often do. We can collect evidence on value of hope if there's a fat tail. So some of them we can, some of them we can't. I know that that's so imperfect, and it's probably not a sufficient answer, but it's better than what we're doing before, which is just sort of throwing out like, all these things are important. Well, that's not really helpful either. So I'd say it's one step along the way, which has maybe like 10 or 15 steps. Just digging into this work, this is like 10 more years of figuring this out. This is not ready for prime time, in my opinion.
Thank you. Todd took my main question, but I have another side question related to this, and that is, when you're eliciting different preferences in these groups, what are the size of the focus groups? How many groups do you include, and how stable are the weightings or rankings within a condition?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because our challenge has been, one, we're working in rare disease.
Right.
So we're talking about studies with 40 people in a treatment arm, often not placebo adjusted. And so like in NMOSD, I think we had something like 10 people total participate, but we had invited up to 20. So yeah, they're really small groups, but at the same time, a focus group is 3 or 4 people. So again, I wouldn't think about this as a discrete choice experiment, because actually I think this can lead into a discrete choice experiment if you really wanted to do something broader. And one of our graduate students is actually doing that, taking the p-value NMOSD results and then inputting that into a best worst scaling experiment for more patients and collecting additional evidence. So you're right, it's not very big, but we're interviewing 3 or 4 people at ICER focus groups. So can we push it forward a little bit? The other issue that you're speaking to, which is really important, is this is a group decision-making format. So when you're collecting or eliciting these preferences, I mean, you've got you can't have 50 to 100 people. And that was one of the lessons that was learned in Europe. They actually tried this with 800 people that had multiple myeloma. And they found that half of the people in a follow-up survey didn't even understand what the experiment was doing. So essentially, the results are trash. You have to throw them away. So I think that's why I always pose this less about preference elicitation and more about extending a focus group to understand what's important to patients with the condition. And I would say maybe up to 25 is the highest you really want to go. But it's rich. The discussion is very rich. You're actually doing group preference elicitation. I would also say, look at ICER panels. They're like 20 people making major decisions that influence the pharmaceutical market. I'm sure you've had this as well, Dr. Touchette, that we had a report where one person called Steve Pearson and tried to get us fired. And it turns out that person was a board on one of the companies, and the stock just tanked after the report came out. There's a lot on the line, and there's only 20 people deciding this. I'd argue the same is happening with P&T committees, where you have 10 or 15 people making major decisions that influence access to pharmaceuticals. So again, that's why MCDA was posed as this group decision-making format. I would argue it's less about understanding preferences for the whole population and more about understanding what's happening for this report and how important is it. Further, we also have all the evidence collected in the trial, potentially additional evidence from the literature for specific disease areas. So it's definitely a relevant point, but try not to necessarily think of this as only preference elicitation.
All right, thank you. What other questions do we have? Yeah, Carter.
Hi, Dr. McQueen. Thanks so much for your presentation. I actually interned at Amgen in 2019 with one of your graduate students when you came to give a presentation on MCDA out in 2019. I was just curious to know kind of a little bit more about the pharmaceutical company perspective on MCDA and how the response has been for that, as well as for markets that are not necessarily as cost effectiveness focused, like a GBA or IQWiG with Germany, kind of what the application of this methodology would be for those more clinically focused markets.
Yeah, I mean, first I'd say pharmaceutical companies are, everyone that I've talked to is so for this. I mean, the reason this issue panel came up was because of all of our industry contacts saying, we can't keep doing this. Like, I get that everyone wants us to collect evidence on health equity and on, societal burden and additional criteria relevant to the patient, but we can't just change our whole trial design to collect all of this evidence without understanding how important it is to broader society and then especially to patients with the condition. Some of that's kind of sorted at the FDA sort of patient engagement level before the drug is even developed and before the trial is even started. So I'd say that it's very welcome to this. They're like pressing me to get stuff published in this area, but just so you know, and so everyone, it's hard to get this stuff published. It's hard to push forward a new method. We've received a lot of pushback from our own field, really. People aren't that interested, unfortunately. That said, we are having some success. And then to your second question, yeah, like groups like IQWiG in Germany, I think it's pretty relevant, just like it's relevant in the US where the quality is so controversial, to at least present almost a cost consequences approach where you've got, we're still using modeling, right? And for everyone that says cost effectiveness and all the pushback that we get, that's like a ratio of two numbers that were produced by a model. And that one calculation is the easiest part of the model. That's like the easiest thing to do. It doesn't have to be a ratio, but it does help us understand how much more we're willing to pay for a health outcome. So I would say, and really my proposal is for government bodies to have this table of costs and consequences. Here are all the costs, here are all the consequences, but all the rankings of the domains for each one of those categories is ordered from the highest level of importance down to the lowest. And it's really important that the preferences of those rankings represent the patient stakeholder, and then anything beyond that in third-party stuff, that requires a whole different issue, which we're trying to address later on in the grant. So I think it can be useful, even if it's to inform deliberation and not include specific scores. It pushes the field forward in a supplemental way without having to replace everything that we've done and everything that we've worked on for the last 20 years. But we'll see. I don't know. I haven't really heard anything from Germany, but I have heard through the grapevine that, Joe Biden's administration is interested in MCDA for value assessment. And there are some other state affordability boards that might actually want to use this as well. And, Colorado now has one. I'm an advisory council member on that. And there are a few other states like Maryland that had the first affordability board. They could absolutely use this. And there's no threshold discussion. It's just to help us deliberate.
Right, fantastic. Simon and then Keebum, and then I think that's probably all the questions we'll be able to do today. Simon, did you have a question?
Brett, great to see you.
Hey.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Brett, how you doing?
Sure.
Simon here. Presentation. Really interesting that you're finding success with MCDA because the UK folks kind of abandoned it as an approach, as you're kind of pointing out. So I'm gonna watch with interest. In fact, this is actually a request rather than a question. We're holding a HTA engagement for developing the value set for the EQ5D youth measure. Would you be interested in participating? This is basically something that I'll follow up with you on, but
Yeah.
Nancy Devlin and a few others are involved in this. And so it's directly related to the kinds of issues that you're talking about. So I'm going to reach out to you. I didn't realize you were so closely aligned with some of these issues, so that's fantastic to see this work.
Well, thank you, Dr. Picard. It's good to see you. I didn't know you were here, so I would have made a joke about you or something if I knew. I'm just kidding. No, I think, and I tried to press this earlier, that I think there's so many different alternative methods in this area. The one thing we learned from the UK, don't go down the road of asking patients, to rank third-party costs or societal issues that really don't impact them. That's where the UK got into so much trouble, and actually where ICER got into trouble when they tried this really early on, because they had attempted MCDA and Steve just abandoned it. My whole point was, can't we focus our MCDA effort into health outcomes that are not captured by instruments like the EQ5D? I know that that's super controversial. And if you talk to like, when I talked to Andy Briggs about this, he got so angry that I said that something like the EQ5D, and I think I was referencing the 3-level, was not sensitive enough to pick up on small changes in health outcomes. And I'm not even suggesting that. I'm suggesting everything that we're not capturing in the trial, which you could argue we're already doing in the EQ5D. I totally get it. How can we help ourselves just bring structure to that conversation? That's just the bare minimum that we can do. And it's not even difficult. It's really pretty straightforward. So, I mean, I'd be happy to join. Thank you for the invitation. And if you didn't know, my first dissertation paper was in the patient, and I basically correlated the EQ5D with glycemic control in diabetes patients and showed that despite complications, despite drug use of different insulins and all the different add-on therapies, there was this clinical observation that people come in and they have a terrible A1C at that visit. They feel like crap, and they felt like crap for a couple of months, and it shows up in their EQ5D 3-level instrument. And so that was a part of my dissertation. It's still my favorite paper. Like 6 people have read it, right? No one's really read it, but it's still one of my favorite papers. And I don't think we do enough of that. It's not necessarily mapping. It's just more creating a clinical, plausible situation where we can show that these instruments actually do have an impact on things like the EQ5D. So thank you for the invitation. We need to catch up anyways. So ideally with beer, but that's okay if it doesn't.
Well, that's why you're supposed to come here, Brett.
I know. I'm sorry.
That's okay. No. And Keebum, what's your question?
Hi, Brett. This is Keebum. It's great to see you here. And, so I actually moved to Chicago a couple of months ago.
Gosh, how are you? Yeah.
I'm doing well. And, so I'm going to see you in the issue panel 6 in the Eastport if you are going to be there.
Good.
So,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, my question is, like, when we actually create a MCDA criteria and weight, is it okay to include the representatives from the completely different stakeholders, or the MCDA criteria creation should be limited to the one parties that highly related with patients or payers?
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Kim. I don't know if I knew that you moved to Chicago, but I also don't even really know what year it is with the pandemic. So, I mean, I'm kind of, still in my office at home and have been for so long. So congrats on the move.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, this is the crux with MCDA, and it goes back to, I think, Dr. Lee's question. Do you have a big enough sample? Do we have enough heterogeneity across, preferences? Ideally, MCDA would, that's why I had that original table that said, what can we capture that's from your perspective specifically? I don't want to ask anyone about a condition that they have no experience with, because that's not really fair to the patients and the end users. But at the same time, I'm not going to go and tell Express Scripts that their members really care about, whatever that happens in their health insurance plan beyond the premiums and the co-payments that they're paying, right? So this is the difficulty, and what I tried to express as a limitation is you really need to, and I think why we tried to address this with an efficient process that would happen within a focus group environment, so to speak. Can we do this at a micro level first and see if we're successful? And if we do that and we have an MCDA score, then it's the stakeholders that we're voting on. It's the voting panel. But I think what you're trying to get at is, what about the broader panel? Do they represent the rest of the country? Like, does Rena Conti or does Stacy Dusitzina or does Alan Balch, do these folks represent our United States citizens? Well, the answer, of course, to that is no. I mean, they're really brilliant people, just like all of you as well, that work on this every single day. So they understand things that no one else understands. So we're kind of going through this, probably what Dr. Picard has gone through with the EQ5D. Are we looking at regular society? And I don't mean this as a derogatory term. I just mean, like, are we just looking at citizens off the street to just come in and do this experiment? Or do we want people to have some sort of healthcare understanding of the background of healthcare? I wish I had the answer for you. We are still working through that in our AIM 2. And there's a lot on the line, but I think we're kind of falling at this. Let's have all the stakeholders in place at the table. So have you read Pave's paper on derivation of value elements? If you look at Maryland's paper, they're only focused on the patient perspective, but they actually picked like patient advocates as representatives of patients from chronic disease, rare disease, all these different stakeholders. So we're kind of thinking of it at the same level, like one health economist, one clinician, or a set of them, right? So like 3 health economists, 3 clinicians, 3 general members of society, rare disease representative, chronic disease representative. That's kind of the way we're thinking about it. I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you that it's perfect, because it's not. But can it push forward a framework for someone like ICER to pick up? I mean, I guess we'll find out. So.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Actually,
right.
so when I through this question, it's just a kind of about what is kind of the nature behind the MCDA criteria. So I mean, we can just catch up with each other later, and I can talk to you more.
Yeah, please email me.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, fantastic. We're well beyond time, but I think that's because this was such an engaging topic and there's a lot to talk about. So thank you.